Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Golden, the director of the school, and it's a huge pleasure to have this evening with us Jos Delbeke, who is the Director-General of Climate Action for the European Union. He is not only in the kitchen for the climate change negotiations, he's one of the chefs that are going to hopefully deliver us over the next 7 weeks an effective climate change agreement which will make the world a much better place to be in over the next 50, 100, 200 years. So a lot is resting on his shoulders, and I'm really delighted that he's found a day in his packed schedule to come here. The Oxford Martin School works on the biggest challenges of the 21st century across many areas, but climate change is clearly one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. And if we are able to resolve this challenge, it certainly will be one of the great achievements of this century. We are working in many areas in the Oxford Martin School on it. We have 7 different programs, from climate modeling to looking at economics and many other things. And so we have been delighted today to be able to host Jos with our group to think through many of the issues. Jos is now a climate change expert, but he started his life as an economist with a PhD from Leuven University in Belgium. He was accepted to the IMF on their very prestigious Young Professionals program, and then he very quickly saw the light after 1 year and left the IMF. He's been perceptive since a young age, returned to the EU, to the Environment Director-Generalship, where he became the Deputy Director-General, responsible for many things, including vehicle emissions. So this isn't a conversation about Volkswagen and vehicle emissions, but he knows, I'm sure, more than anyone in the room about that topic because he wrote the rules, which are now being broken. He moved over in 2010 when Climate Action Director-Generalship was established to become its first Director-General, and he has been there ever since. You might have heard Connie Hildgaard, who was the Climate Commissioner, who spoke here some months ago, working with her, and now the new Commissioner on this incredibly important program. He's been instrumental in the establishment of the European trading mechanisms, in many of the other major advances that the EU has seen over the next 5 years in climate. And he's recently written with Peter Fiss, who I'm also delighted to welcome this evening, who was the advisor to the previous commissioner, a book entitled EU Climate Policy Explained. So if some of the questions you want are not fully enough explained, I encourage you to delve into the book after the lecture to get more of it. So, Jos, we're delighted to welcome you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good evening to all of you, and thank you, Professor Golden, for this very warm words of welcome. It's a real pleasure to be at the Oxford Martin School and to have a chat with you, and I look very much forward also to the discussion about climate change, because, you know, we try to do something about it in Europe, and at the same time we try to motivate the world, and we are negotiating towards Paris. And so I would suggest that I deal with 3 topics in my conversation of tonight. First, we quickly look at the science of climate change. Then we go into what is at stake in Paris. And then we spend a few words about what we are really doing in Europe, what is working, what is less good working, and what kind of lessons we can draw out of that. Now, here at the Oxford Martin School, the context cannot be better about the future generations. And the planetary boundaries is something that the Stockholm University has been investigating quite a little bit. And we know that we are at a real risk when it comes to biodiversity and about the nitrogen cycle. But there is another triangular that is getting very worse by the day, and that's climate change. Now, it is not yet as bad as in the case of biodiversity and the nitrogen cycle, which means perhaps if we are clever, we can do something about it. So it is part of a question about the planetary boundary when we look at how it evolved between the pre-industrial times and today. Now, climate change is an environmental problem. It's truly global, but there is a problem with it. You cannot see it. You cannot see it with the naked eye. You cannot smell it. You cannot touch it. It's a problem that scientists have discovered. And the scientists have been grouping themselves in the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And thousands of them come together. They debate and they make a consensual report every 3 to 5 years. And so in the latest reports, they made 4 key conclusions. The first is that the climate systems are warming at an unprecedented rate, not just compared to the last decades, but also compared to the last millennia. And we are talking about the last 800,000 years. So really something spectacular is changing. The second conclusion is that it is human influence that caused part of this change. And the third conclusion is that the entire world is involved. We suffer from the consequences from climate change all over the globe, and it doesn't make a difference where the emissions are coming from. So it's a truly global environmental problem, and that is why the brutal reality is what we do in Europe about it only makes sense and makes a difference if others are doing similar things, because we all hang together. And the fourth conclusion is that we have to limit climate change to 2 centigrades warming compared to pre-industrial times. What does that mean? That is that warming is already happening. We have to slow down the warming, and we will not be able to, get away all warming, so we will have to cope with the consequences of that. But if the global warming would go beyond 2 degrees Celsius, then we come into a really risk zone. So you have seen some of the graphs. This is only about the last 100 and so years, since 1850. And you see in the last 30 years, while there is a cyclical movement of the temperature, when we take the averages per decade, it really goes up. And this is since the beginning of the measurements on temperature that started in the early 1800s. Now, if we compare where we are today compared to where we were in, say, the year 1900, you see the warming is displayed all over the globe, but there are different zones. There are zones that are more touched, and there are zones that are less touched, even if the world as a whole is heating up. Now, the question is, where do we see it the most? And just a few examples. If we look in the right-hand quadrant there, the Arctic summer, we see that the sea ice over the summer is declining very fast. And in particular in the Arctic, the effect of climate change is twice as pronounced as in this zone of the world. And what is one of the dramatic results is the disappearance of the sea ice. That is giving rise to new navigation routes. And we see that, for example, Russia and China and Japan are very eager to use this liberated, or the sea liberated from ice, to instigate new navigation zones. So that means that that part of the world, the Arctic, is going to change dramatically over the next 30, 50 years. Also in geopolitical terms, the Arctic is not owned by anybody specifically. So we are going to see geopolitical tension also coming up in an area that is not too far away from us. But the sea level change is, of course, the most obvious one that we are all familiar with. But there are many different ways of expressing, but for us, I think the Arctic is a zone not too far away from us, and the sea level rise are the most important ones. Now, what we see on mainland, for example, over the last decade, is that flooding is actually happening more frequently. Here in this part of Europe, but also in Central Europe, you see the dark zones indicated. In other zones, we have much more droughts. So it has a lot to do with water. Too much water in some areas and in some periods, or not enough water. And so desertification is creeping in also in parts of Europe, in particular in Southern Europe. So it happens all over the globe, and it happens also in Europe. That is what I wanted to show. Now, the IPCC also made a kind of carbon budget, an amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we can tolerate up to the 2 degrees Celsius, because 2 degrees Celsius is a theoretical notion. How much greenhouse gas emissions stands in comparison to that? And they calculated that since this industrial revolution, we used almost 515 gigatons, and that the amount left is only 275 gigatons. And now looking into the world where since the Industrial Revolution we see this happening, we were not that many at the time of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, we were only with 1 billion people in the year 1900. Today we are with 7 billion, and we go to 10 billion by 2050, hopefully 9, but you know, a lot of people, a lot more compared to where we were in the past. So we were not that numerous, and still the biggest amount of that budget has already been used. And so it's high time to share out that last bit. And you know, that last bit, it has to do with economic development, will be the subject of quite intensive negotiations, because those countries who want to industrialize, who would like to have a better standard of living compared to what they had before, they say we want to have a standard of living like you have in the West. And we build that standard of living up based on the amount that is already used up. So the question that people were asking to the scientists, very nice to indicate what is happening, but tackling climate change, can we afford it? Is it possible? And what they said is yes, in fact, it is not that expensive. It would cost on average 0.06% of economic growth for the globe as a whole. And if we estimate that business as usual growth is going to be between 1.6 and 3%, it appears to be a tiny bit. So it is nevertheless 0.06%. You know what we would do in Europe to have 0.06% higher economic growth. So it is not negligible, but it is affordable. And this translates not in economic growth that is gone forever, but it is rather postponed. It is a delayed economic growth. Because what we have to do in this delayed economic growth is invest more in clean and low carbon technologies. And these technologies happen to be a little bit more expensive than their alternatives. Now, all this is calculated without taking into account the benefits of reduced climate change, because if we can mitigate climate change, then there is going to be less flooding and less desertification, etc. But it's very hard to calculate in exact terms what that means. So the standard economic analysis left that besides and said, well, economic growth is going to be delayed with 0.06%, and on top of that, the benefits in terms of reduced climate change are going to manifest themselves. If we would not do anything, then we see that the costs are going to increase quite significantly. And that is not a prospect I think that many of us would like to undergo. Now, what kind of measures are we talking about? Now, climate change has to do, since the Industrial Revolution, by the emissions of greenhouse gases. And these emissions of greenhouse gases come from the use of fossil fuels. And the use of fossil fuels, that's energy. And so what can we do? Primarily, use less energy and use energy that is not produced with the use of fossil fuels. So it goes without saying that the way to do it is to be much more efficient in the use of our energy and switching around away from fossil fuels to low carbon and no carbon energy sources. What are they? The most obvious example is renewables. A solar panel, a windmill, it's not producing greenhouse gas emissions. The maximum one can say is the construction of a windmill requires cement and requires steel. To produce this steel and this cement, there are some greenhouse gas emissions that are related to that. But once it is there, then you can produce low carbon technology, low carbon electricity. The other major source of low carbon energy is nuclear. And you know, well, nuclear, there are lovers and there are haters of nuclear energy. That has nothing to do with climate change. It has a lot to do with the assessment of the risk related to climate change. Is nuclear energy considered to be risk-free, yes or no? That's a big debate. In some countries, like in this country, there is a plan to go further with nuclear. In other countries, like in Germany, there is a plan to move out of nuclear. And we have even countries, member states in the European Union, who have forbidden through the constitution to ever go into nuclear technology. Like the case of Austria, for example, where it is forbidden through the constitution to go into nuclear energy. So nuclear energy is a little bit of the splitting issue, but also in putting up renewable energy, there are also mixed voices, because not everybody likes a windmill. Perhaps one is okay, perhaps 10 is okay, but thousands of them may be less okay, because people say the intrusion on the landscape and etc., etc. So you know the debate. So what is the basic mitigation measure? More efficient use of energy, more use of low carbon or no carbon energy, and the third element is the use of carbon sinks. And carbon sinks is forestry, basically forestry and land use. Forests take out carbon out of the atmosphere and they store it into the wood. And in particular, tropical forests are very important. Or put it in the reverse, removing tropical forests, like what is currently happening in Brazil or in Southeast Asia or in Africa, is having a disastrous effect on climate change. And so there is a lot coming up about how to maintain at least tropical forests, and on land available, how to build, how to plant new trees. And is this theoretical? No, it isn't. If you go, for example, to China, China has been taking away lots of forests at the time of Mao and the old communist regime. Today, they are replanting mountain by mountain, with forests in order to protect themselves against the landslides, which is an environmental effect they want to prevent, but also to improve the carbon sinks and to take out greenhouse gas emissions out of the air. And of course, the last element is the lifestyle and the behavioral changes. A very difficult one, because it's very good to say and to realize that we have to use less energy, but our lifestyle is such, in particular, for example, when it comes to transportation, that the more the richer people become, the more demand they have in terms of transportation services. So they are flying to Ibiza not once in a year, but 3 times, 5 times, 10 times a year. And they consider that as very normal, or they have more, traffic services that they are using to visit family, etc., etc. So lifestyle is a very difficult one. So that's why putting the emphasis on the first two, what can we do through technology, before we really go into the hardcore of asking people not to use their cars any longer whatsoever, which is a hard call. Perhaps we can start them asking to use less the car instead of immediately talking about removing altogether the car. So mitigation measures, they exist. Technologies exist. We know what to do. And then there's the real question, are we doing it? And are we doing it in the planet, in the world altogether? And that's why I would move towards the next part of my talk about the international negotiations. But before I do that, I could not hesitate to show this graph, which is a visual reflection of what the IPCC has been doing, that if we would take the measures that we know we should take, then we can cope with climate change. It's possible, it's affordable, it's possible, but it still needs to be done. And that is the question that is on the table for us in Europe when we develop our domestic policies, but also at the international level when we are negotiating with other parts of the world, the emerging economies in particular. So, how are we doing on these international negotiations? In fact, it all started in 1990. 1990 is the year where the consensus amongst the scientists was emerging that something murky was happening in the field of climate. It is the IPCC, the first reports, saying there is really something ugly at hand, we have to act. And that was translated in 1992 in the first World Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where several major documents were adopted. And the one that is of importance here is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the constitution, so to speak, that was adopted in Rio, according to which we are now still negotiating, and the run-up to Paris is in the context of this Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, if you ever would have a look at it, is full of long sentences. We should do more of this and that. It's not very specific in the numbers that need to be crushed. And so in 97, there was a protocol, an operational document of the United Nations Framework Convention, and the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Japan in 97, which was a landmark and is still a landmark. But there is something of a flaw in that Kyoto Protocol. And that is that it has a very strict divide between the obligations of the developed countries compared to the obligations of the developing countries. And that is the spirit of the 1990s. The world was, to put it a little bit, short, the world was simple. You had the rich world and the poor world. And that is reflected in the Kyoto Protocol as it is reflected in the Framework Convention. And what was asked for, that is that the developed countries, the industrialized countries, would reduce their emissions, and the developing countries would support that. There were no obligations for developing countries. Of course, the developing countries were undergoing the effects of climate change. So adaptation was incurring costs. Think about the Bangladeshis and the flooding that they have regularly to undergo, or think about the AOSIS, the small island states in the Pacific that are disappearing because of the effects of climate change. So in the Kyoto Protocol, that was all recognized, but the reduction of emissions was something that was only there for the developed countries. Now today, we are now moving towards Paris. The world has changed. And I would like to show you 3 graphs how the world has changed only since the year 2000. You see in the graph, the graph is a graph, everything is going up, but one line goes straight up and springs to the eyes. And it starts not earlier than in 2002, 2003, say 10, 12 years ago. And these are the emissions of China. So the emissions of China were at the level of the EU, the US, a normal level, so to speak, given the population around. But as of 2002, it shoots up. And today, China is responsible for 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So, is the question, we have the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol having obligations for developed countries, but the developing countries, out of which China is an example, you know, they represent today 1/3 of the emissions, 3 times the emissions of the EU, twice as much of the emissions of the United States. So the wake-up call for Paris is, we have to have a conversation about how to bring the emerging economies, of which China is the clear indication here, how to bring the emerging economies into the global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And again, I like to stress that it happened after the year 2000. So when the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol was done, then it started to move up at a fantastic speed, and this resembles, of course, the very spectacular industrialization of China. The other question is emissions per head, because you could say, in the world, there should be some fairness. You are entitled, one way or the other, for every living person on the world to have an emission per head. Not that that should be translated strictly into negotiation, but let's have a look at how it is going. You see the green line, which is the line of the United States, the highest on Earth, and it is going down. But in 2013, the latest year, the emissions per capita in the United States are still, say, more than twice as high as the emissions of the EU, the blue line. You know, the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol. It was Al Gore who was in Kyoto, and he signed the Kyoto Protocol, but the United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, so they left the club. And so the second message for Paris is, we not only need the emerging economies on board, we also need the United States on board. And behind the United States, there is Canada, there is Australia. They all walked away, and in fact, in the Kyoto Protocol, the EU was left on its own, obviously with Norway and with Switzerland, but not many more. So a Kyoto Protocol only covering the EU is not making a lot of sense, because the EU is reducing its emissions. It is now time to press the United States and others and the emerging economies on board. The Chinese figure is also a very important one. The emissions per capita were very low at the level of India, but as of 2002, the emissions per capita go up, and remarkably in 2013, the average Chinese citizen is emitting as much greenhouse gas emissions as the average European. So just indicating that you could say there is some margin of maneuver for those with a very low level of greenhouse gas emissions per head. But after a certain while, you know, this question needs to be addressed. Is it all gloom and doom? No, it isn't. When we also start as of 1990, and we plot the CO2 emissions per unit of GDP, you see that it is everywhere going down. That means we in the world succeed in creating economic wealth, but per unit of economic wealth, we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and it is fairly spectacular in countries like China or the Russian Federation, also bringing down that part. What does that mean? What does that reflect? That is that all countries in the world are taking out the worst technology and are putting in low carbon and cleaner technology. Not perhaps the cleanest, but cleaner. And in particular in China, the fact that so many old-fashioned technologies in the sector of steel and cement and power generation were taken out indicates that the curve has been improving. Now the EU, the blue line, is beneath. It's not doing that bad. I think You see that our policies are starting to deliver results, but of course there were also other developments in the EU that placed us in a very different spot compared to where we were before. I come to that in a minute. So, what is then the big picture for Paris? The big picture is that we all agree that the world as a whole has some margin of maneuver to get to the 2 degrees Celsius, but by 2020, the world has to have reached its peak, and then the emissions have to go down. Without that, we will never reach the 2 centigrades Celsius. But beneath that, the developing countries will be able to grow more, while the industrialized countries are already forced to reduce their emissions up to minus 85% in 2050. And the heads of state of Europe have accepted that we have to go down, and we have a declared target, for example, by 2030, as an intermediate target, that we are going to reduce in Europe already minus 40% compared to 1990. But there is a different treatment, and that reflects, of course, the reality of the emerging economies, which is under the name developing countries. But developing countries are not countries like Ethiopia or Angola or Vietnam. These are emerging economies like China, like India, like South Africa, like Mexico, like Korea, who are increasing rapidly their emissions. But the industrialized countries have agreed that they have to reduce earlier and significantly their emissions. So the world is different. And so what we ask before every country comes to Paris, that is that they would make a policy pledge, an INDC. And an INDC stands for an independent, nationally determined contribution. Why did we ask that? Because this divide between developing and developed countries led us to a real nightmare in the international negotiations. So 3 years ago, in Durban, we negotiated, and the EU got its way, that all countries would negotiate in 2015 in Paris a new agreement, but before coming to Paris, that they would make a policy pledge, a kind of policy program indicating how they would reduce their emissions. Now, over the last 2 months, the numbers have been ticking up to 150 countries. Today, there are 156 policy pledges from countries all over the globe. And gradually, the figure was filled up. And you see that only in the Middle East, obviously, where they have other fish to fry in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, they had not had time to do their INDC. But the rest of the world has come forward with their INDC, including China, including India, including the United States. All those difficult clients from the past, they came with their policy pledge, and they said, for our own self-interest, that is what we're going to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now is the question, is that effort going to be enough? And so, just a couple of days ago, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Secretariat, published a report saying we are not going to get close. We are going to get closer to the 2 degrees Celsius, but we are not going to hit the 2 degrees Celsius yet. So the advice of the scientists that we have to go down to 2 centigrades is not fulfilled with these policy pledges, but we are rather landing at around 2.7 degrees. So this is plotted, what the UNFCCC just has been saying. If we would not do anything, we would end up with the red line, which brings us up to 4.8 degrees Celsius. If we have to go to the 2 degrees Celsius, that is the bottom line, we have to switch away, according to the green line, quite dramatically. Where are we landing today? We are here. We are at the crossroad where the business as usual is clearly trimmed down, where the business as usual development is changed up to 2.7 degrees Celsius, which does not bring us yet to the 2 degrees Celsius, but is nevertheless functioning already as a quite important change in policy. So given that, what is it then that the Europeans want for Paris? The first is the Europeans, you have to understand they play with, in the United Nations context with 3 blocks: the United States and its allies, China and the group of developing countries, and the EU. So there are 3 blocks maneuvering. And the EU stands for the ambition, and the ambition is the link that needs to be made with the IPCC with the 2 degrees Celsius. It's obvious that if we make an agreement in Paris, we can say these policy pledges do not yet bring us where we have to be, but we make progress, and that needs to be enshrined in the treaty. And that treaty should be legally binding, because we cannot have it that the government is signing up in Paris, and then next month the government falls, or next year there is another government that said, oops, we are not bound by the idea. So it should be legally binding, one way or the other. We know legally binding is a tricky issue for the United States, because if it is legally binding according to the Kyoto Protocol, they may have problems to pass it through the Senate. So we are looking at ways to have it legally binding without, forcing the United States per se going through the Senate. A third element is the transparency and accountability, which is a bit of a dry bureaucratic thing. But what is transparency and accountability? That is that we need a set of common rules according to which we can compare all the countries and the efforts they are doing. And we in Europe, we are insisting a lot on that, because after a while, we should be able to compare the efforts from the United States and from China and from Europe and from all countries in the world and see, in a very objective and neutral way, whether they have done their job. It goes without saying for a rational mind like we in Europe, but I can tell you that some players, such as China, for example, does not look forward to have a United Nations set of common rules that is going to scrutinize their economy. So there is quite a bit of tension around these elements that we are currently negotiating. And a very important one is a 5-yearly review. You may have read in the newspapers that President Hollande was in Beijing the day before yesterday, and the main thing that they agreed to, which was not agreeable so far with China, is that every 5 years we would review and review upward the commitments made by countries, because we know that the Chinese have a solid INDC, but there is some margin to do better than what they were submitting. And of course, as China is big, it matters a lot whether we would have a 5-yearly review. And the fifth element is that the EU, as always, is ready to give international support for those in need on adaptation, on capacity building, the transfer of technology. So I think we are reliable on that. In fact, in 2014, 14.5 billion euros were given to the developing countries in terms of climate finance. 14.5 billion for EU 28, which is quite remarkable. As an amount of money, it went up with more than 5 billion in the middle of the economic crisis. So for Paris, I would like to conclude my talks on the international negotiations. It is of capital importance that we have the emerging economies and that we have the United States on board. Without that, Paris is a failure, because the EU is alone in the Kyoto Protocol and represents not more than 10% any longer of worldwide, of global greenhouse gas emissions. So as a consequence, we need the other 90%. And this INDCs is the first step to bring them on board. And with this platform, I think it doesn't look too bad for Paris, but these negotiations are very complicated. There is always a possibility to derail one or the other thing, and not every nose is put into the same direction. There are always forces that rather would prefer that there is a little derailing instead of having a success. But we have to trust the French, who have been putting a hell of a lot of diplomatic capital into this, and they have been doing that in a fairly skillful manner. So let's keep our fingers crossed that on the 11th, 12th of December, we can land a deal in which not only Europe, but also the United States, the emerging economies, China, is doing its efforts. So the last part of what I wanted to deal with you is, what are we doing in Europe? Do we really make a difference? And the solid line is the way the emissions have been developing so far since 1990. You see it's going down. And the latest figure is for 2014, where we have minus 23% compared to 1990. And our leaders decided on 40% in 2030. So that is quite a reduction, 40% based on 1990, with the commitment to go down to 80% by 2050. So it's hard work to every year to make sure the emissions are going down, and going down more compared to what we did in the past. Now, this is not a very appealing graph, but this one is more. And what does the graph show? That if we plotted on 1990, we have been reducing our emissions with almost 20%, while our GDP has gone up with 45%. And as a consequence, and that's the green line, and the green line is almost a straight line, so whether it is good economics or bad economic times, the line shows that per unit of GDP, we are decoupling GDP development from emissions. Of course, there are many things playing at the same time. Since the 1990s, we have seen the globalization and a lot of industry leaving Europe. We have also seen since 1990 Central and Eastern Europe that was highly energy inefficient. So there are some historical developments, but still the green line shows that we are decarbonizing structurally the economy. So what is it that we could summarize on our experience? And that is in the little booklet that Professor Golden was mentioning. That is that the clear experience in Europe is you have to get started. And once you get started, you know and you learn the game by doing. And you have to act on several things. There is no single policy that is doing the whole trick. You have to act on the power sector, the manufacturing sector, transportation, etc. And you have to prepare it very well. The economic and the technical analysis is absolutely important. And when we look at the graphs and at this technical analysis, how we were reducing our emissions, it is not through reduced economic activity that we were reducing our emissions, but through a combination of these two boxes, which is the energy intensity of GDP and the carbon intensity of energy, which is the heart of the structural change that we have been making in Europe. And we want to continue that up until 2050. And if you just look at 2030, the target sector on which most policies are acting is the power sector. By 2030, the power sector will have decarbonized up to more than 50%, which is quite remarkable, which is a combination of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and nuclear energy. And so our heads of state decided that we would reduce our emissions with 40% in 2030 And at the same time, we would increase our part on the renewable energy up to 27% and improve our energy efficiency up to 27% in the same time perspective by 2030. Now, how are we doing that in Europe? There are two big chunks. The ETS and the sectors falling outside the ETS. I do not want to be overly technical, but the ETS is an emission trading system that is covering all industrial installations in Europe in the power sector and in the manufacturing industry. Some 11,000 installations are covered by the ETS. And this ETS squeezes out carbon reductions at the lowest cost. So if there is a low-cost way of reducing carbon, whether it is in Scotland or in Greece or in Finland or on Cyprus, this low-cost reduction of carbon is being seized through the ETS. Now, the ETS covers half of the emissions of Europe, and it is a truly market for which there is a market, because if you have allowances under the ETS and you do better than you are supposed to do, you can sell that allowance on the market. So it has a market price. And that is the evolution of the market price of the allowances under the ETS. You see it's fluctuating. That's normal. Every market has fluctuating prices. But still, there are two things that spring to the eyes. The first is, in 2007, the price was going down to zero. And we conceived the period before 2008, which was the official beginning of the Kyoto Protocol, as a pre-period, as a try-out period. And so there was no banking of the allowances from one period into the other. And there was a surplus of allowances in the market because all industries thought, my goodness, this carbon market is going to kill us. We are not going to have enough allowances, enough quota to emit our greenhouse gas emissions, which turned out not to be true. And so a lesson we learned is that you have to have a market in which there is scarcity. And so scarcity was there. 2008, 2009, prices were around 15 euros per ton. But then in 2012-13, prices fell down again. And that was the fallout of the major industrial crisis we had in Europe in 2008, 2009, 2010, where the price was falling deep and is only now recuperating up to a market price today of 8.5 euros. So we had to learn the job in putting up a carbon market. We understand now the mechanics of this. We are sharing this, for example, with China. China is now introducing a carbon market like we are doing, and we have our daily contacts with them about how to do it, and we share information. And the President, Xi Jinping, has announced that such a carbon market like we have in Europe is going to be rolled out for the entire China in 2017. Today they have 7 pilot programs, the most industrial zones, and by 2017 the Chinese carbon market is going to be bigger than the European carbon market. One element that we are struggling with on the carbon market is carbon leakage. Our manufacturing industry is pretty nervous. Sometimes the power sector is okay, but the manufacturing industry says, we incur higher costs because we have to pay for our carbon, but our competitors producing steel or aluminum and sell their steel and aluminum on world markets at world market prices, they are, better off than we are. So we have a competitive disadvantage. So what are we doing to cope with that? We give them allowances to emit greenhouse gas emissions. We give them allowances for free, so as to soften the impact on international competition. And so the biggest sectors are cement, steel, refineries and organic chemicals, which is 3/4 of the allowances that are given to them in order to accommodate their competitive position on international markets. They are not getting everything they want, so there is always a pressure on the price, but they get a big chunk, and that is the system that is going to be continued in the days to come. So what is the market volume today of this carbon market? In terms of tons of CO2 equivalent that is being traded, we are trading more than 8,000 million tons a year on the carbon market, and the volume in terms of money exchanged on that had its peak in 2011 with more than 80 billion euro exchanged on that market. Of course, the price fell down, as you saw, and in 2013, the price fell down to half of that. The second measure in Europe, apart from the carbon market, is the build-up of renewable energy. You see, the build-up of renewable energy goes slowly, but steadily up. And in particular, since 2010, we have a declared policy, and this policy is being extended up until 2030. And what you see is that, in particular, in the highest ranges, in the field of solar and wind, there is very rapid increase in installed capacity. Once you travel to the north of Germany, for example, or to Denmark, you can see it from the plane in which huge fields, also in the North Sea, we see windmills. In major parts of Europe, they are covered by solar panels. So this renewable energy is clearly rapidly increasing. And we have targets per member state shared out. And today, we are at 16% of energy consumption that is generated through renewable energy. This is today more or less as much as nuclear power generation. So the renewable sector is really growing very fast. I hate to point you at the UK that is lagging behind. I think that the UK and Malta and the Netherlands is lagging behind the most in terms of delivery of the targets that will have to be produced. But you see other countries like Sweden, where almost 50% of energy is generated through renewable energy sources. So it's quite a variety of experiences we have in Europe. But we also had to learn something with the renewable energy. And that is that the support schemes that we were giving to renewable energy were widely diverging in one country compared to the other. And so we are now addressing this situation in bringing in more market variables because, for example, the build-up of renewable energy in Germany was completely shielded from any market influence. And we in the Commission, we opened up that debate, and that is now gradually changing, where public tendering, contracts for difference kind of experiences are being introduced. And of course, the grid is very important, and that is a kind of a new challenge coming in. That is that there are lots of windmills in the north of Europe. The consumption of electricity is in Central Europe, but all this electricity needs to be transported from the north to the south, and the grids are not traditionally equipped for that. But the best news for renewables is that the more we install, the more costs are going down. So you see for wind and you see for solar how we are approaching already grid parity to conventional electricity generation. When the wind is blowing in Germany, for example, it's electricity that is almost free on the net, and traditional power generation can be shut down. On solar as well, on sunny days, there is a plentiful of free electricity available. So this kind of grid parity experience is really a revolutionary development that is going and that risks putting upside down the entire internal electricity market in Europe, and next year we plan a policy initiative on that. The third measure on which I think we were not doing too bad in Europe is on energy efficiency. If we would not have done these standards for appliances, like kettles or standards for buildings, then the red line would have gone up. And what we see instead is that we have been reducing the need for energy in Europe quite significantly. So on energy efficiency, which is a very hard target because there are so many millions of households that needs to be reached to motivate them to do the right thing. Nevertheless, I think we succeed European-wide in improving significantly up to 16-18% energy saving achievements over the last couple of months. And the last example that I would like to give is cars. I think it was mentioned that car standards are being developed in Europe. Look at this line. The dotted line is bringing down the CO2 emissions per kilometer driven for cars. And for 2021, I think that Europe is the absolute champion on that. Of course, we have to improve our checking, as was mentioned, and as we are seeing on the traditional pollutants, like sulfur and NOx, and we are doing that. But on carbon dioxide, no illegal activities have taken place. Sometimes the law is a bit stretched in one or the other direction, and so we have to tidy up some loose ends in the law. But I think you see the line, how much consumption, fuel consumption by cars has been brought down, and a car is a standardized product that is traded freely on the internal market, so it's important that Europe is doing its work. So to conclude, what do we see in the energy mix of Europe? In not more than 20 years, we see that the line shown that overall the energy consumption in Europe is going down with some 15% between 2010 and what we expect for 2030. What you see coming up is the green blocks, which is the part of renewable rapidly growing. And what you see, the black boxes at the bottom, that is the role of solids, lignite and hard coal, that is really going down very fast. The shares of the other parts are more or less staying the same, which is nuclear, oil, and natural gas, staying roughly the same, but of course within a context of reduced energy demand. And that is a rational policy for Europe, because we are in a very unstable environment when we look geopolitically. We buy a lot of gas from the east, from the south, but we know that all these regions are relatively unstable. So producing more energy in a diversified manner only weapons us, not only for climate change, but also for a better energy situation in Europe. And that is the reason why it is not for nothing that the title of my intervention today was Climate and Energy Policy, but one is the flip side of the other. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Jos, for that really insightful talk, which I really feel encouraged by. You, the chief negotiator for Europe in these negotiations, and so I'm very encouraged. It's also just remarkable to hear about some of the achievements so far, reducing emissions so radically despite European growth, and the ambition, the scale of ambition, 85% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, 40% by 2030. It really does make me proud to be European, and it also makes me even more convinced than I was already that the UK needs to stay in Europe if it's going to have any weight in these negotiations, but that's a separate conversation. There are, of course, causes for alarm. I think you were signaling that with the current pledges, we're not going to get to 2 degrees. You were mentioning 2.7 or 3. That's clearly way too high. So there's a huge amount of work still to be done, and of course that's what you're going to be doing over the next 7 weeks, and we'll do what we can to help you in that. And of course some of these integrations of renewables into the grid to make renewables effective as well. So we have about half an hour for questions and answers. Jos has kindly agreed to take questions. This is being filmed and webcast, so if you do not want to ask any questions, don't stand up or say anything. Camilla, do identify yourself as well.
Yes, thank you. My name's Camilla Tolmin. I work with the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. We do a lot of work, particularly with the least developed countries. I've been very interested to see the aggregation of the INDCs, which are very impressive, but in order for them to be implemented, that will cost money. And the first costings are looking at maybe 500 or 600 billion dollars for them, in comparison with the 100 billion which is in the Green Climate Fund. So how do we bridge the 100 billion in the Green Climate Fund with the 500 or 600 billion that we need to implement the INDCs, which, as you've said, are not in themselves going to be enough to keep us down to 2 degrees?
Well, I think that's a very good question, but the beauty of the INDCs is that governments have to explain what their policy is and how they are going to implement it. And when you walk around and you ask the World Bank or our own banks, European Investment Bank or the KfW or whatever, there is no shortage of money. What the problem lies is governance, and governance in particular in the recipient countries. I give an example. I was around in one or the other INDC that was launched, and I went to Morocco to replace my commissioner there. It was an official event. The Prime Minister was there, the Minister of Energy, Environment, a big jamboree, the INDC. And you ask yourself, Morocco, a standard developing country with a rising population, rising economic prosperity, so rising energy demand, what are they going to say? And they said, well, we have a lot of sun, and we have a lot of space in the Sahara, so we want to have, they'll become the leader on solar energy in the region. And they were appealing on financial supporters, on engineering companies, and the fact that they got their act together makes them now that in Ouarzazate, for example, is one of the biggest solar installations of the world, I think, concentrated solar power. And it's just an indication that good governance drives more than the available finance, what needs to be done. I'm not going to downplay the role of finance, but I think that finance may go more to those in need, those suffering from adaptation, you know, like the Bangladeshis, you know, people who are displaced, etc. I think that most of the public money has to go there, but if there is good governance, the investments we need can easily be brought forward by the private sector in terms of blending public money and private money. And I think there are very good examples out there, and the calls that the World Bank has been making, Dr. Kim, for example, is just that, give us good governance. We are ready to invest.
Tim, then Alex.
My name is Tim Palmer. You mentioned the word globalization obliquely, but let me come to it bluntly. If you compared China's CO2 emissions per capita with Europe, and you made the point that they're now very similar. But how meaningful is it really to do that comparison when presumably a substantial part of that CO2 is used to make goods which are exported and consumed in Europe?
It's about consumption as well as production.
Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer. I explain why. When we negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, the concept was to keep things simple and to have every country responsible for the direct emissions coming out of their country, or like in the emissions trading, every company is responsible for the direct emissions coming out of their chimney. So if everybody plays ball, then you have a vehicle to assign very clearly the responsibilities. The problem comes when part of the world is not playing ball. And then that is the situation we currently are having. That is that China has not yet a strict commitment that it has to live up to. And so we have an implicit tendency to, to buy from China and to reduce our emissions in an artificial manner. So to put a long story short, I think we should continue to follow this direct emissions approach because that's the simplest way. It's already fairly complicated to assign responsibilities to all people. But there is an issue related to consumption, and in particular, our emissions per head have not gone as fast down compared to the delocalization of our industry. And one of the reasons is transport. Transport emissions go rising whatever happens. The richer people are, the more they produce greenhouse gas emissions to transport in a very frustrating manner. And we see it on the streets of all over Europe. We get traffic jams because of the freight and because of the passengers, and our airports are being crowded. Transport is a real nightmare. And I think, and I would hope that we get cracking on transport, on the technology, but also on traffic and transport management, because otherwise we are not going to be able to deal with that. So I would not think that the shifting of goods is the predominant thing. It's rather lifestyle issues that are going to become problematic.
I'm Alex Taylorborn. The EU emissions trading scheme is sort of the crown jewel of EU climate policy, and the Commission is very keen to tinker with it and make sure it works, and they've done very great work with the Market Stability Reserve. But my question is there any political will to include more sectors into the ETS? At the moment, only 50% of the emissions are covered, but there's 50% of the emissions left. You've just talked about transport. There's transport, there's buildings, and of course there is also aviation, which at the moment we're only covering intra-EEA. Will we go back to covering all flights into the EEA, and also will we increase the auctioning of the allowances for aviation?
We are fully in favor of widening the number of sectors covered by the ETS, but there is one condition, and the one condition is that the monitoring, reporting, and verification of the sector must be outstanding. The ETS today is the unique environmental regulation on which compliance is higher than 99%. I do not know any environmental regulation that is having such a high compliance when we talk about water pollution or air pollution or whatever. So, and we want to protect that, very dearly. Now, we were looking into transport, but transport users are the entire population, that's you and me. So the approach to transport is somewhat different compared to the direct emissions approach, and that is a complicated manner. So far, the Commission has not proposed it, because with the prices we currently see, the ETS would not make a change in the behavior of people when it comes to covering their transport emissions, compared to what we see today under the ETS. Under the ETS, under power, the power sector and the manufacturing sector, we see a difference. So on transport one day, I think we should be able to do that, but we have not yet proposed it because we thought we first have to go to the regulation of the vehicles and the regulation of the fuels. Now we have done that. We have all sorts of regulations on the quality of the fuel and the cars and the lorries, etc. And we are a bit stuck also in the double regulation argument. There is a lot of criticism towards the Commission. Are all these regulations hanging together? And we are very shy in multiplying, overlapping regulations. So that is an additional reason why we have not yet been jumping forward on transport emissions, except for international aviation, on which we were called back by the ICAO, which was not a pleasant experience, but at least we are now covering aviation within the European airspace. But we have the commitment to extend international aviation through the ICAO system. And it's frustrating to wait for a couple of years, but if we would succeed, then the whole world would be covered by international aviation. And I think, It was frustrating to be, to have the setback only for Europe. But if we could use that leverage to cover the whole world, perhaps it may be worthwhile to wait for another 5 years.
One more question here, then we'll move to the back.
Robert Cohan from Princeton University, USA. I study international politics, so I want to ask you about the international negotiating positions. So I agree entirely with you on the targets and on the review process, which is crucial, and accountability and transparency. But I don't understand why you want a legally binding agreement. For the United States, even a treaty commitment is not legally binding. It can be overridden by an ordinary law. So why take the big step of asking for a legally binding agreement, which the United States cannot deliver, when it wouldn't even produce anything that is really quite valuable from the point of view of a real constitutionally binding agreement?
Can I reverse the question? As a European, it's hard to understand why the United States is so emotional about an international treaty. I mean, when you deal with an international treaty, normally it has to have some legally binding aspects. Otherwise, it's considered to be, too open. But I do understand, as I was mentioning, that there is a particular problem, and we do want United States on board. So that's why we are negotiating, because between legally binding and not legally binding, there is a gray zone. And it has to do with compliance. How do you organize compliance, for example? And we are now, teasing out the ground of that gray zone in pushing the United States as far as possible in coming on board, but at the same time not pushing them overboard that, the Senate would turn the treaty down, which would bring us back as we were in Kyoto, which was very unfortunate, and we lost a decade almost in terms of environmental effort. So it's a very tricky balance, but for a European it's hard to understand while we are having an EU where we are giving powers to the EU. Not everybody in this country may like that, but that's the nature of the game. You do things together, and then by doing them together, you can have a win in terms of cost effectiveness, what we clearly have under the ETS. By the way, UK had first an ETS scheme, which it was happy to surrender and to forge into the European scheme, because on ETS, the more players there are, the more cost effective the scheme is. So it's very rational policy, and we hope to repeat that example from the UK to the EU, and one day from the EU to a scheme that we can merge, perhaps with China, with Korea, with New Zealand, why not with California and Quebec if at the federal level there is limited appetite to go into an ETS type of regime.
Okay, the woman in the back then.
Thank you. Is this right? Is it working? Thank you. My name's Harriet Bulkley and I'm from Durham University. I'd like to ask you to reflect on the fact that we've had a quarter of a century now of a model of international climate governance based on trying to reach an agreement between national governments. I'd like to hear your view as to whether you think that that approach has run its course, whether it's fit for purpose when we start to think of the climate challenge as one of decarbonisation and resilience rather than reaching an overall common agreement, and what alternatives there might be.
I think we are moving from, schematically put, the Kyoto world, which was a top-down agreement, from a Paris agreement that will be much more bottom-up. I explain. In Kyoto, we agreed figures to reduce our emissions per block or per country. And we had a table. And the EU should do 8%, minus 1990. The United States would do minus 7%, and Japan would do minus 6%. So top down, you negotiate the percentages, then you go home and you implement them. Now, that has not given the result we want. Because shortly after having signed the agreement with the United States, George Bush decided to drop the Kyoto Protocol. Canada had a figure, but they could not deliver the figure, and instead of going for a compliance provision, they walked away. So then you have a binding top-down agreement, And when people cannot deliver the percentages, they walk out, which is also not very satisfactory. So that's why we are now in a much more bottom-up world, and that is the INDC approach. We ask every country, tell us, for your own good sake, what you can do. And that is now what is officially on the table, which is unique. We never saw that. But now we have to put the strings and bells on it, that this is not just an open promise, that this now needs to be implemented. And that is why we go for this monitoring, this reporting, this verification, this accountability. You know, the compliance provisions should be there. And I think that we may be writing a bit of history on the United Nations fabric, because the United Nations approach of the past was top-down. Now, the emerging economies hated that. They do not find themselves in that construction. They said that's post-World War II kind of construction, and we were not there when you agreed that. Now, it's a new time to look at things. Now we are, you know, China, we are Russia, we are Saudi Arabia, we are, you know, we are emerging economies, and we have to rethink that order. And what we are doing in Paris is build up that bottom-up element and try to land in between a pure top-down and a pure bottom-up. And that is where the legally binding discussion comes in again. If it would be just bottom-up, without any strings attached to it, it would be too easy to walk away from it. So that rebalancing is currently taking place, and it may be that in other debates on the United Nations, we are going to see similar things. Because when I talk to my colleagues from trade, for example, they experience the same. The world falling in line with the multilateral agreement and all implementing that, that's no longer happening. That's the past. So we have to try out new models, and the Paris Agreement may be one new element in that.
Okay, this side, gentleman over here.
I'm Paul Fisica from Brooks University. I've observed that most of the policies over the years are focused on nations. And I want to take the case of the Global South, realizing that most of these nations lack the capacity to really implement these policies. Is there any plan to really work on the MNCs? Because I realize that a lot of the problems are caused by the MNCs in the Global South, like, for example, Nigeria, where Shell some years ago said they were going to cut down on emissions by 2007. They changed the deadline to 2010, and this is 2015, and there's still a lot of gas flaring in Nigeria, over 75%. Is there any plan to work on the MNCs?
Multinational corporations.
Multinational corporation, okay. Not a direct plan, but what is of capital importance in this INDC context is the governance, like we discussed. And this governance doesn't fall out of heaven. We are paying a lot of attention on capacity building, on training people to do the right thing, to develop the right policies in their countries. This is not development cooperation money like we did in the past. This is money that is much more focused with the delivery, which is reducing carbon emissions, making the economies resilient against adaptation on climate change, etc. But capacity building is training of people. And that's the way to go. Member states or states are clicking on to that. And they are feeling, you know, much more stronger in standing one or the other pressure. Now, on multinational corporations, it's very hard to control them through that channel. What we try to do, and that is what the French try to do now for Paris, is that they carve out a scope for multinational corporations to bring them around the table, to force them to make pledges about what they are going to do in their policies. And I think the moral pressure is increasing. Also, the whole debate on investment and divestment and etc. is putting the pressure on responsible behavior from these corporations. And that's another track, which is completely outside the UN, but on the fringes of it, but it drives the system in that direction. I think that the United Nations is poorly equipped to get head on with the multinational corporations. It's formed as a coalition of states, And that's the weakness and that's the strength. But that is the way the United Nations is built.
Okay, I think we only have time for one or two more questions, unfortunately. Over there, and then we'll come here, and I'm afraid that's going to be all.
Thank you. Stefan Böse from the Stockholm Environment Institute here in Oxford. I have one question. You mentioned we have seen like energy mixes in Europe. They've diverged significantly. Austria, no nuclear power, UK and other countries, nuclear power. And I want to know, how do you assess the future of European energy and climate change policy with now the recent shift in Poland, where the Conservative Party gained the elections and the Polish people have been very obstructive sometimes when it comes to climate change goals, consuming a lot of coal. A lot of industry depends on coal use. Do you see any changes? Will it be more difficult to keep Poland on board? How do you assess the situation? Thank you.
Well, the energy mix in Europe is indeed very diverse. You have countries relying heavily on nuclear, and you have others like Poland, as you mentioned, but others as well, like Romania, Bulgaria, relying very heavily on coal. So they are not alone. I mean, I would like to highlight that. And this makes our negotiations tough. But there is one beauty about the Treaty of Rome, the Lisbon Treaty as we are currently having it, and that is that there are precise rules according to which you decide on legislation. And the precise rules is qualified majority voting. That means that's a quite high bar, you know, amongst 28 member states to obtain a qualified majority. But that's the negotiation going on, where Poland may have emotions, but they need allies as well. They cannot block on their own. They have to have a blocking minority, as we then call it in our jargon. And the strength is to make good arguments so as to have a qualified majority voting for your legislation. So to put it short, Poland on its own cannot block the implementation of legislation that was adopted in the past. That legislation was adopted and needs to be implemented. And by the way, this legislation is being implemented. I think I have to pay tribute, you know, even if my negotiations with the Poles are always tough. Once a negotiation is done, Poland implements the result of those negotiations. I think it's not because you are difficult in negotiations, then the more important question is, after the negotiations have gone over and the legislation is adopted, what happens next? And so we read now in the press the statements made by the Polish authorities, but we say, for future developments, we have to talk, but for past legislation, which is all the commitments for 2020, they are part of the acquis communautaire, and they have to be delivered. And they know that, and they do that. For example, the build-up of renewable energy in Poland. They are not, per definition, lovers of renewable energy, but they implement the legislation as it was agreed.
Okay, one quick question, final question, and quick response.
John Rees, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. I've got a slightly more critical comment on the EU ETS, which it seems to me you're relying on as your market, as your silver bullet to solve the problems. Now, we've had the ETS now for nearly 10 years, and the price of CO2 is around €5, or around $5. That is an order of magnitude below any estimate of the social damage that's caused by CO2 emissions. And perhaps more importantly, it's an order of magnitude below the levels that are required to incentivize some of the low-carbon technologies that most people think we need. I'll take a relatively non-controversial example.
Let's just pose the question.
Carbon capture. Okay, I'll conclude the question there, but I could go on.
It's true, and I think I was showing that we are working towards better prices, prices that make a difference in driving into the market the technologies that we need, and energy efficiency. Fuel switching between coal and gas is a very important one, starts around €15 playing out. So that is a price level I think that we should reach in a not too distant future. Where we had a setback is the fallout of the crisis of 2008, 2009. And the way the ETS was perceived, you could not correct that overnight. You know, we are living in a democracy. Then you know, you have to go through the legislative process to change your legislation, etc., etc. So to put a long story short, there is the price as it is observed, and the price today is €8.5, and the price is moving up step by step. And I think what is more important is the price expectation. And when I talk to private companies, when they make their investment programs, a lot of companies are doing shadow costing on carbon, and they quickly or commonly use €40 per ton of carbon. So the expectation about the price is as important as the price itself. And the expectation that the price is going up, I think that no longer expects that the price is going to go back to where it was a couple of months ago. So that expectation that the price of carbon is going to be higher, it gives an alert to CEOs and companies that they have to pay attention to carbon. And they may switch one or the other technologies, or say, I'm making an investment over 10 years or 20 years over time. The price of carbon is no longer going to be below €10. It's going to be a much higher price. On CCS, true. The cost of CCS, I think, is relatively high. And we also have been forced to put aside the hope that the carbon market alone is going to push into the market the CCS technology. It's far too, you know, I read figures of 70, 80 euros. That is not going to happen overnight. That I have to admit. But between that and where we are today, I think there is some margin of maneuver on which we have strong evidence that the carbon reductions in private companies was going much faster compared to what anybody would have anticipated. So having a price on carbon really matters.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jos, for such a thoughtful, reflective, and I think very frank as well, not least for a European civil servant, commentary on where we are, what we can hope for, and some of the things to think about. I'm also particularly delighted that clearly, like all very good civil servants, you draw on science and the evidence in coming to your conclusion. So it's so good to see a confirmation that all the hard work that so many academics do to build the evidence base is being used so effectively. So thank you for that as well. This is clearly one of many activities we're doing in the area of climate change. You'll be aware that Nick Stern gave a talk at the Sheldonian Theatre a couple of weeks ago. That's now up on our website with his slides and video. So if anyone's interested in looking at that, I encourage you to do that. And it's also one of the many events that we have here. Tomorrow, we have Richard and Daniel Susskind at 5 p.m., same time, same place tomorrow, on the future of professions. You might have picked up that they've just brought out a book on this topic. Tomorrow will be the book launch. It's been very widely acclaimed, not least in recent Economist and FT reports. So that's tomorrow on the future of professions. On Thursday, we have our regular seminar. This is the 10th anniversary term of the Oxford Martin School, and so we're having a series of seminars that focus on outputs of our various work programs. The one this week will be by John Milbauer and Brian Nolan on inequality, called Mind the Gap. And as you might have picked up in the citation of Angus Deaton for the Nobel Prize in Economics, John was his co-author on the paper that he was cited for the Nobel Prize. So I encourage you to come to the seminar, which will be here at this time, 5 o'clock on Thursday. Then the following Tuesday, the 10th of November, we have Hein de Haas, who has just stepped down as the director of our International Migration Institute, talking about Behind the Headlines, investigating the drivers and impacts of global migration and refugees. This is, as I mentioned, the 10th anniversary of the school. We have just published our report. It came out yesterday on reflecting on 10 years of our achievements. So I encourage you to pick that up and also to come to our 10th anniversary lecture in the Sheldonian Theatre on the 23rd of November by Lord Martin Rees. who is speaking on Will Technology's Dark Side Eclipse Humanity's Bright Future? So the future of technology and society. All of these things require registration on our website. It remains for me to thank you again, Jos. All, should I say, renewable power to you as you go ahead with your negotiations. All the very best, and thank you for being with us.